Welcome to our deep dive into Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. We found this fascinating podcast episode breaking down this classic. And you know, it's crazy how relevant this story from 1953 feels in our digital age. Today, we're not just giving you a book report. We're going to explore why Fahrenheit 451 still resonates so strongly and uncover its chilling parallels to today's world.
What really gets me about Fahrenheit 451 is how it reflects our own obsession with screens and mindless entertainment. Bradbury seemed to predict a future where technology would hinder critical thinking.
It definitely makes you think, could this really happen?
Yeah.
So let's set the scene. Imagine a future where firemen don't put out fires, they start them.
Oh, wow.
And they're targets. Books. Owning a book is a serious crime, and it's the firemen's job to burn any they find.
It's a world where knowledge is literally set on fire.
Yeah, pretty intense.
And in this world, we meet Guy Montag, a fireman who at first follows the rules without question. He's almost like a poster child for this society, blindly accepting what he's been told. But everything changes when he meets Clarisse, a young woman who is completely different from anyone he's ever known.
She's not just a free spirit, is she?
No, she's so much more than that. She challenges Montag to actually see the world differently. She observes nature, asks these really thought-provoking questions, and actually enjoys real conversation. And Montag, who's used to a world of instant gratification and surface-level interactions, is totally caught off guard.
It's like she's speaking a language he's forgotten.
The podcaster is called Clarisse the Spark that ignites Montag's curiosity. It's a really good description because she introduces him to the possibility of a world beyond the screens and the prescribed way of life that he's always known.
And the spark leads him down a dangerous path. He begins to hide books, reading them in secret, and realizing just how much beauty and knowledge have been lost in this book-burning society.
It's a gradual transformation, but it's fascinating to watch. He goes from burning books to being totally captivated by them. It really shows that human need for knowledge and connection that even a society like this can't get rid of.
Right. You would think in this world everyone would just accept things as they are. But Montag's journey proves that the human spirit can't be controlled that easily. Part of what drives his rebellion is his wife, Mildred.
Ah, Mildred. She's like a cautionary tale. She represents the worst of this technology-obsessed culture. She's always glued to those parlor walls, those giant TV screens that basically take over their home.
It's like she's living in a virtual reality, plugged into those screens and just popping pills to numb any real emotions. The podcasters actually use the phrase glued to the screens, which reminds me of how we can get sucked into social media today. The endless scrolling and curated content that just reinforces what we already believe.
The echo chamber effect, exactly. And just like Mildred avoids real conversations, some people today retreat into these online spaces where they only ever encounter information that confirms their existing views.
Okay, so we've got Montag, who is waking up to the power of books, and Mildred, who's lost in this world of shallow entertainment. Then there's this big question that hangs over everything. Why are books so feared in this world?
Well, it's because books hold the power to disrupt. They contain ideas, different perspectives, and the potential to challenge the way things are. They make you think for yourself. And that can be dangerous to the people in power who want to stay in control.
The podcast mentioned a scene where Montag tries to share some poetry with Mildred and her friends. It's a really important moment in the book because their reaction is extreme.
Oh, I remember that scene. It's intense.
They are terrified of the emotions that the poetry brings up.
Right. They're so used to feeling numb and detached that any kind of deep feeling is seen as a threat, like they're allergic to actually thinking or feeling anything beyond the surface level.
It makes you wonder, what are we missing out on when we avoid things that challenge us? Are we giving up true connection and intellectual growth just to stay comfortable in our own little bubbles?
These are questions we all need to ask ourselves. And it brings us to one of the most complicated characters in this novel, Captain Beatty, Montag's boss. He's got this really interesting relationship with books.
He's not just some mindless rule follower, is he?
Not at all.
The podcast pointed out that Beatty is actually very well read. He gets the power of books, and yet he's the one in charge of burning them.
Exactly. He's a walking contradiction. He says that books lead to unhappiness and that ignorance is bliss. It makes you think, what happened to him to make him believe that?
The podcasters thought that he was battling some serious inner turmoil, like he's trying to stamp out his own curiosity or even guilt.
It's like he sees destroying knowledge as the only way to protect himself and others from the pain and potential chaos of critical thought. But his speeches about why books had to be banned are terrifying. He says that knowledge makes people unhappy, that not knowing is better. and that everyone should be kept equal by being kept equally uninformed.
That's a terrifying thought, to think that someone could believe that getting rid of knowledge is the key to happiness and a peaceful society.
It's a scary reflection of how those in power can twist information and control the narrative to keep their authority. And this battle between knowledge and ignorance, freedom and control, it's at the heart of Montag's own struggle.
He's torn between the comfortable numbness of his old life and this new desire for knowledge, even though it puts him in danger. And the story forces us to ask ourselves the same question: which side are we on?
Which brings us to the ending of Fahrenheit 451. It's often described as both bleak and hopeful.
Without giving too much away, the podcasters talked about how Montag eventually escapes the city and finds others who are dedicated to saving knowledge in a really unique way.
They're called the book people. And they're not hoarding physical books. Instead, they've memorized entire works of literature. They've become living libraries. It shows that even when the actual books are gone, the human spirit finds a way to keep those ideas alive.
It's a powerful image. Like, even in a world where books are outlawed, the human mind can become a sanctuary for stories and ideas.
Exactly, and that's where the phoenix comes in. Even when everything is destroyed, there's always a chance for rebirth. It's a message of hope, showing that even when things are at their worst, knowledge and the human spirit can come back from the ashes.
But even with that hopeful image, the ending of Fahrenheit 451 makes you ask some tough questions about what happens next.
The podcast highlighted a few of these. How do you rebuild a world that has destroyed its own intellectual history? Can you ever truly get back what's been lost? And how can we stop it from happening again?
Those questions stick with you long after you finish the book, and they feel especially important today when we think about how technology and the spread of misinformation can affect our own ability to think critically.
It's like Bradbury was warning us, telling us to be aware of the things that could lead us down a similar path toward intellectual and emotional emptiness.
Before we move on, let's talk about some of the cool trivia the podcasters shared about Fahrenheit 451. Did you know Bradbury wrote the whole first draft of this book on a rented typewriter in a library basement?
Wait, really?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
And get this, it only cost him 10 cents for every half hour he used the typewriter. The entire novel cost under $10 to type.
Wow, talk about dedication.
Right. Oh, and speaking of cost, did you know the title Fahrenheit 451 is the temperature at which paper burns?
Oh, I didn't know that. That's a pretty powerful reminder of the destruction that runs through the whole story. It's not just about burning books, it's about burning ideas, burning freedom, burning the very things that make us human.
It really makes you think about the dangers of censorship when it's left unchecked. The podcast also mentioned the 1966 film adaptation of Fahrenheit 451. Apparently it's visually stunning, but it changes some key parts of the story. It might be worth watching both versions and seeing how they compare.
That's a good idea. It's always interesting to see how different forms of art interpret a story. You can often learn something new from each one.
Okay, here's another piece of trivia that surprised me. Bradbury said he wasn't mainly focused on government censorship when he wrote the book. He was more interested in how television and mass media could make people less likely to think critically and create a society that just passively consumes.
And here we are, discussing this book on a digital platform. It shows how Bradbury's concerns are still relevant, even with how much media has changed.
It highlights how important it is to be active and engaged with the information we consume. We can't just let ourselves be passively entertained. We have to think critically, question things, and analyze what we're taking in.
It's a powerful reminder that we all have a responsibility to be discerning consumers of information. We can't just believe everything we see and hear, especially in a time when there's so much information and the potential for manipulation is high.
Exactly, and that's a perfect way to lead into the next part of our deep dive. We're going to explore what Fahrenheit 451 means for us today. Get ready to go even deeper.
So we've talked about this world where books are against the law. But what's even more disturbing is that the lack of books isn't the main problem. It's a sign of something deeper.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's the real issue then?
The lack of critical thinking. The people in Fahrenheit 451 aren't just afraid of books. They're afraid of the independent thought that books can inspire. They've given up their intellectual freedom for a comfy, curated reality.
You know, it's funny. I was thinking about those parlor walls. They weren't just giant TVs, right? They were like a way to keep people distracted, to control what they saw and heard.
Exactly. And that control doesn't always come from some authority figure. Sometimes we do it to ourselves. We choose to be around information that just backs up what we already think, even if it means ignoring other points of view.
It's that echo chamber thing we talked about, and it makes me think about how easy it is to get stuck in our own online bubbles. We follow people who agree with us, we get our news from sources that tell us what we want to hear. It's almost like we're creating our own versions of those parlor walls.
It's a sneaky kind of censorship.
Right.
We may not have firemen burning books anymore,
Hmm.
but we're still limiting ourselves from ideas that could challenge us or make us feel uncomfortable.
You're right. And if we're not careful, that kind of isolation can make us vulnerable. If we're not used to thinking about different perspectives, how can we tell what's true and what's not? How do we form our own opinions based on critical thinking instead of just blindly believing what we're told?
It's like Bradbury is warning us that the biggest threat to our freedom to think isn't always some outside force. It's our own willingness to give up our ability to think critically. And once we lose that, we become easy targets for manipulation, for propaganda, for people who want to use our apathy to get ahead.
It's almost like being lazy with our minds becomes a way of sabotaging ourselves.
That's a perfect way to put it. So what can we do about it? How do we fight against this tendency to become intellectually complacent?
Well, I don't think it's about getting rid of technology altogether. That's not realistic. But maybe it's about being more aware of how we use it.
Right. We can actively look for different viewpoints. We can have respectful debates, even when they're tough. And we can support places that encourage critical thinking.
Like libraries and schools, those are so important.
Definitely. And it all comes down to recognizing that knowledge is power. But knowledge without critical thinking, without the ability to analyze and evaluate information, can be just as dangerous as not knowing anything at all.
I think it's easy to fool ourselves into thinking we're well informed just because we have access to so much information these days. But like we see in Fahrenheit 451, the amount of information isn't what matters, it's what we do with it.
It's about asking questions, challenging what we think we know, and being willing to change our minds when we're given new evidence. It's about understanding that learning is a lifelong thing and that there's always more to learn.
It's funny, the podcast mentioned that Bradbury was inspired by his own experiences during the McCarthy era. It was a time when people were afraid to speak out, afraid to be different, afraid to challenge what everyone else was saying.
And that fear created a culture of silence, where people were more worried about fitting in than standing up for what they believed in. It reminds us that censorship doesn't always come in the form of book burnings or government orders. Sometimes it's the censorship we put on ourselves out of fear or not caring.
So, how do we fight against that? How do we become brave in a world where it feels risky to say what you think?
I think it starts with recognizing that courage isn't about having no fear. It's about doing the right thing even when you are afraid. It's about speaking up for what you believe in, even when your voice shakes. And it's about supporting others who are doing the same.
I love that. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. Now, speaking of courage, let's talk more about those book people, the ones who memorize entire books. That takes a special kind of commitment.
It's an incredible act of resistance. They know that knowledge is worth saving, even if it means putting themselves in danger. And their actions show that even when things are really bad, there will always be people who won't let the light of knowledge go out.
Their dedication to preserving those stories is so inspiring. It reminds me of the power of human connection. Even in the toughest situations, they found each other, built this community, and dedicated themselves to keeping those stories alive. It makes me wonder, what stories are we responsible for preserving today?
That's a really good question to think about. What knowledge, what experiences, what perspectives do we think are important to pass on? And what can we do to make sure those stories are heard and remembered?
That's a powerful thought to leave with our listeners. I think we've covered a lot in this section. We've explored the dangers of censorship, the importance of critical thinking, and the amazing resilience of the human spirit.
We've talked about how Fahrenheit 451 is a cautionary tale, but also how it reminds us that even in the darkest times, hope and the search for knowledge can survive.
Ready for another round of trivia? What else did the podcast tell us about Fahrenheit 451?
Well, you mentioned the movie, but did you know there's also a play and even an opera based on the book? It's interesting how this story has connected with people through so many different art forms.
That makes sense. The themes are so universal and timeless.
Another interesting thing is that Bradbury got some of his inspiration for the book from his own experiences with libraries. He was a big reader as a kid, and he saw libraries as safe spaces for knowledge and imagination. It's kind of fitting that he chose to set his dystopian novel in a world where libraries are outlawed. It shows the terrible consequences of losing access to those important places.
It's ironic, right? He wrote the first draft of the book in a library basement, and in the world he created, libraries are the enemy. It shows how much he understood the value of what he was fighting against.
Exactly. And it reminds us that the fight for intellectual freedom often happens in unexpected places. Sometimes the most powerful acts of resistance are quiet, subtle, and driven by a deep love for the things we care about.
It makes me think about the small choices we make every day, choices that contribute to a culture of curiosity or a culture of just going along with things. Like, do we choose to read something challenging? Or just scroll through our phones? Do we have meaningful conversations? Or avoid topics that might lead to disagreements?
Those choices might seem small, but together, they shape the intellectual world we live in.
I think that's a powerful takeaway for our listeners. Our choices matter. They contribute to a bigger conversation, a bigger culture, and ultimately a bigger world.
It's empowering to think that even in a world that can feel overwhelming, we have the power to make choices that support intellectual freedom, curiosity, and a love of learning.
We've spent this whole deep dive exploring the world of Fahrenheit 451. And wow, it's been a crazy journey. We've talked about censorship, the power of books, and how important it is to think critically in a world where we're always being bombarded with information.
You know, it's funny, the podcast episode we were talking about, it asked a question that really made me think. It wasn't just, how do we stop this dystopia from happening? It was, what if it's already happening?
Whoa, that's a scary thought. It makes you wonder, are we already living in some version of Fahrenheit 451 without even knowing it?
Think about it. We're constantly being hit with information. A lot of it is designed to distract us or keep us just passively taking it all in. Critical thinking often takes a backseat to entertainment and wanting things right away.
And just like those characters in the book, we can get so caught up in being comfortable and staying in our own little echo chambers that we lose the ability or even the desire to see things from different perspectives.
It's like a sneaky kind of censorship, choosing to stay within the boundaries of what we already know instead of going out and exploring new ideas.
So if we're already living in a world where critical thinking is in danger, what can we do? How do we rebuild? What are the tools we need to get back our intellectual freedom?
Well, the book gives us some clues. Remember those book people who memorized entire works of literature to save them? They became living libraries, carrying that knowledge even when the physical books were gone.
It's such a powerful image. It shows that even in the worst times, human memory, connection, and the desire for knowledge can still survive. They found each other, made a community, and dedicated themselves to keeping those stories alive.
Exactly. It reminds us that knowledge is worth fighting for, even when it feels like the whole world is against you. And it shows how important it is to pass things on, to make sure future generations have access to the ideas and stories that have shaped our world.
So even though Fahrenheit 451 is a pretty dark story, it also gives us some hope, doesn't it? It reminds us that even small acts of resistance can change things.
Absolutely. It's about understanding that we have choices, that we can decide how we engage with the world around us. It's about reading books that challenge us, having tough conversations, and looking for different viewpoints.
It's about being active in the world of ideas, not just passively consuming things. It's about questioning, challenging, and really engaging with everything around us.
And it's about realizing the power of stories. Stories connect us, they teach us, they inspire us, they help us understand the world and where we fit in. In a way, we're all book people. We carry the stories that have made us who we are.
That's a beautiful thought, and a perfect way to wrap up our deep dive into Fahrenheit 451.
It's been amazing to explore a book that still speaks to people so many years after it was written.
And as we try to understand our own world, which is getting more and more complex, I think the message of Fahrenheit 451 is more important now than ever.
We hope you enjoyed this deep dive, and that you'll walk away with a new appreciation for the power of knowledge, critical thinking, and the enduring strength of the human spirit.
Thanks for joining us.